letting me interview you. So I would like to ask you 3 questions on Mahatma Gandhi.
Okay.
So my first question is, what is your perspective on Gandhi and his teachings?
So my perspective is, having grown up in India, I grew up in New Delhi, and I grew up in the 70s, and so by that time Gandhi was a major figure. We learned a lot about the fact that he was considered the father of the nation, and he had done to a lot of his own personal sacrifice. He had managed to bring freedom to India, and so in some ways his teachings about truth, speaking the truth and always being truthful to one's objectives was something we were taught very early on, and non-violence was the other thing. So we learned a lot about Gandhi and Gandhi's perspectives, and then as we grew older in school, we also learned about how Gandhi's struggles for independence influenced other major figures in the world, like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela.
Okay, so my next question is, did you learn about him in school? Did you learn about him at home?
So, as I said, we learned a lot about him growing up in school for sure. October 2nd, which was his birth date, was considered a big day. There were always school celebrations to mark the life of Gandhi, and in every grade, teachers would ask us to do something. We were taught about Gandhi's life as a student, as a lawyer, then when he came from South Africa, the struggles he had, how he managed to work with other leaders and mobilize them to fight against the British, and how he had come up with this interesting new concept on non-violence. Sometimes he was larger than life figure. He was like a superhero, and yet growing up in school reading comics and all that, we always thought superheroes were like Superman and Spider-Man, and they wore fancy costumes, and here is Gandhi wearing a dhoti and wandering around with a stick, and he didn't quite look like a superhero, but yet all the things that he had done somehow managed to be like a superhero.
And from my research, I've read and heard that he didn't want to necessarily be worshipped as a god, but he wanted people were worshiping him so much that they weren't forgetting some about his cause.
Right. So in Delhi there's a big memorial to Gandhi, and then for school field trips we would go to where he's cremated, and it's a beautiful like the monuments in DC for various presidents. It's a place called Rajghat where Gandhi's ashes are kept, and you can also see the various sayings of Gandhi. So it is something that we learned about at every single grade, and as we got older we learned a lot more about his life and how he pursued vegetarianism and non-violence and treating everybody equally, whether they are Hindus or Muslims or whatever caste or class they came from. Sometimes I will tell you, as growing up, it is difficult to think that one could live the life of Gandhi, because it seemed too difficult for a small child to think that you can always speak the truth and always be non-violent when you get involved in a fight. But it was also very inspirational that here was somebody who was able to do so much to get us finally independence after hundreds of years of British rule.
As I've heard before, so Gandhi was born in Gujarat. So, the attacks and other things in 2002 and 2003, I think, were they because he was born there and because of the partition that he gave to the Muslims
No, I mean, India has had this very interesting history with Muslims, considering Muslims have invaded what we call the country of India since maybe the 10th century, and they have always been an interesting relationship, because the Mughals and the other Muslim rulers prior to that and after that, they gave us a lot of good things, whether it's in food and music and the clothes we wear and so on. And they coexisted along with the Hindus and the other people in the country of India. And there were people in the Congress party who were not happy that Gandhi did not fight for keeping the whole country together. In fact, the partition that created West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which is now called Bangladesh, a lot of people felt that Gandhi should have done more to try and prevent the partition. And so what happened in 2002, which is as a result of Hindu-Muslim riots, that tension occasionally flares up, but India has also had lots of Muslims. In fact, India has more Muslims than any other country in the world other than Indonesia. And in fact, no, and other than even in fact the richest Indian is a Muslim. Some of the most successful film stars and cricket players are Muslims. So there's a lot of assimilation of Muslims, and yet there is also discrimination because they are seen as being of a different minority.
Are they seen as, like, I've heard of, like, the lowest caste is the untouchables? Are they considered as, like, untouchable, or they?
No, they're not. They're just considered as a minority, and as every minority, minorities want to have certain rights. And Gandhi, his whole principle was that everyone should be equal, and he went out of the way to uplift the people who are not equal to others. And so that sometimes angered and annoyed the people who had privileges and rights for decades and centuries. But Gandhi believed in his principles, and he was not going to give up on his principles, and that is something to me admired, I think, but it's also very difficult also, I think, because most of us don't live like that all the time.
Is Gandhi's teachings and other things portrayed in his, like, family members who still live on the next generation?
So growing up, I think when we're your age, let's say 5th grade or 5th standard or 6th standard, it was all about, in some ways it was sort of like worshipping Gandhi. We learnt about Gandhi very superficially. We learnt about his songs, we had to recite his prayers, and we learnt it like that. And as we grew older, then I also was able to form my own opinions. I was able to discuss, read his own books, My Experiments of Truth, and Satyagraha, which is his Truth Shall Always Win, and his nonviolence movement. You learnt a lot about him. There were 2 or 3 sayings that I think are still extremely relevant today, and we tend to use them without realizing that Gandhi popularized them. The one is, be the change that you want to see in the world around you, and that's something even today we talk about it. So if you want to see some change in the world, then you should first live that life, and otherwise you can't expect everybody else around you to change. Walk the walk. That is very much for what Gandhi said.
And an eye for an eye.
The other one, an eye for an eye, is a good one because that is sort of his basis of his non-violence. We always think if somebody were to slap you, you should return it back with a slap or tit for tat, even though there are other religions that say turn the other cheek. Gandhi turned that phrase, an eye for an eye, which goes back to the old Babylonian times. He added a sentence which I think was very nice when he said, an eye for an eye will make the world blind. So if somebody pokes you in the eye and you were to return that with another poke, you might feel temporarily good because you've retaliated, but Gandhi's point was if everybody retaliated every time somebody fought, then the whole world will become blind, which I think was also another good phrase. And so I think Gandhi gave us some sentences that we think are take for granted about change and about an eye for an eye, but basically his teachings about truth and non-violence I think are still very, very relevant in a time when you find that all over the world people think that conflict is the way to resolve a conflict is by fighting rather than through peaceful means. Even though it might take longer, I think ultimately the peaceful means are maybe more sustainable.
And you can, like, live by the peaceful means, and that it can solve things even though it takes longer, like you mentioned. It might solve them more successfully, so you don't have ongoing conflict between.
Right, because it also means to be peaceful and to not retaliate means you also need to develop your willpower to control your own emotions, and that one thing Gandhi practiced a lot in terms of having self-control and discipline, and not everybody wants to live that life. Gandhi is considered a saint because he had very few means. He wove cloth, as you know, and wore simple cloth. He didn't have very fashionable clothes. He didn't drive around in fashionable cars. So he may be slightly out of place if he were to suddenly be born today, because we have so much technology around us and so much things around us. Gandhi did not care. The other sentence that is very important, I think, when Gandhi said was, there is enough in this world for man's need. There is not enough in this world for man's greed. So in other words, if all of us, if we want to satisfy our basic needs, there's plenty of resources in this world. But the reason we are running out of resources is because we are very greedy, is what Gandhi would say. Everybody wants more and more bigger houses, more cars, more gadgets, more toys, more this. And he says if everybody gets more and more greedy, there is not enough resources.
So that's part like, I think at the beginning we were watching the film. When he came back to India from South Africa, he went on a whole like
Bharat Darshan,
like, kind of tour of India.
Pilgrimage of India.
And so the guy was talking to him, Charlie, I think.
C.F. Andrews, yeah.
Yeah, and he was like, okay, like it wasn't paying attention very much because they were driving through a street that had lots of poverty.
Right.
And so that brings up a good point to your his saying that you mentioned, like all the middle class, well, more of the rich and middle class are taking more, which leaves the lots of poor people with really a lot less, which puts them into poverty.
Right.
And so
and poverty is the root cause of a lot of problems. So he was wanted everyone to help uplift the poor and not just say it's the poor's problem that they're poor. He thinks that society should do everything it can. So I think ultimately, Gandhi is one of the most inspirational figures in history, world history of all times. And it doesn't mean it doesn't have its flaws. He's not God. He's not Superman in that sense. And yet, for a simple man to lead such a life and inspire a whole generation in India, but then also generations of people in the US and South Africa and so many other countries around the world, there must have been something to him that I think still resonates why people pay attention to Gandhi. So
do you think that if Gandhi was born, like, say yesterday or a few years ago, and he was in this like time, do you think he would, with his nonviolence movement and satyagraha, would he be able to be like a peace ambassador and break up wars, or would it only work if he or people like him were being targeted? Would that also be? Would, like, if he was in today's times, do you think he would be able to be like the United Nations and help break up wars, or do you think it would only work if he was a part of that like conflict?
That's a good question. I mean, Gandhi, irony was that Gandhi maybe passed away too soon. He was assassinated a year after India's independence, and he never won the Nobel Prize, despite being one of the most peaceful people in some ways. That is a controversy. So whether Gandhi would be as relevant today. So I think you need people like Gandhi in today's times when there's so much violence and conflict, not just between countries, but between different factions and different tribes and different peoples. But he may also be, don't be surprised if suddenly Gandhi were to come up today, whether we will accept him, because you have to be a leader, you need followers, and whether he'll have enough followers, it's an important question. My hope is that if somebody were to be like Gandhi, he would continue to inspire people like you and youngsters to take the path of non-violence, rather than thinking that by firing weapons, that's the only way to solve problems.
Yeah.
But we don't have anybody like Gandhi right now. So maybe there is a demand for somebody like him if he were to.
Wasn't there someone in Delhi a few years ago who went on a big fast?
Anna Hazare, he's called. So people who follow what are called Gandhi's principles are called Gandhians. They tend to lead a very principled and simple life, and they aspire to be like Gandhi, even though it's very difficult to be like Gandhi. So a couple of years ago, there was a gentleman by the name of Anna Hazare who was very old, but he also led a very simple life, and he managed to mobilize hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the capital of India, Delhi, because he was against corruption, and he wanted people to take action by protesting the government's corrupt practices.
Just a regular civilian.
He was just a civilian who, just by the sheer principles of the life he led, was able to inspire the college people and students to lead a good life. So it is possible, but whether you can sustain it over years, like Gandhi was able to do it for decades, that is the trick question, and that's the key question.
Also, I think nowadays they might not accept him also because he need to really make his mark, and sometimes the look can be like people can give misconceptions about him,
Right.
because you might not think that a little man in a loincloth
Yeah.
can help
Right.
stop a war.
Yeah.
So that also has to put something in play. They think like a big soldier with a
Right.
bunch of weapons might be able
Right.
to do it. But
Absolutely. I mean, that is very true.
So thank you for letting me interview you on this long chat, and your interview will really come in handy.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.